Hi, Beto.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Where are you?
I'm in Wichita, Kansas, with my parents' house, unsurprisingly, given everything
Yeah.
that's going on. But good. Well, thank you for coming, Beto, coming to speak to our members. It's great. Your second event of term. Um, so wonderful you to come. I think everyone on this stream probably already knows who you are, but just to introduce you, you are, uh, sorry, um, you are a 2020 presidential candidate who ran the Senate against Ted Cruz in Texas in 2018, set a record for the number of Democratic votes in an election in Texas state history. And he's going to be speaking to us about lots of different things, what he's doing right now and what he's doing for the future. So the floor is yours.
Yeah. Adam, thanks for having me out, and for everyone on the call for making some time and inviting me to speak and answer your questions. A couple of thoughts, just some things that I've been thinking through and thinking about. First of all, uh, folks in the U.S. have every right to be really fucking bummed out right now about how this country is managing or failing to manage this crisis. So you have more than 50,000 people who have died, twice the amount of any other country. And in fact, you could put the next two closest countries together and they would not equal the total that we have here in the US. You have a president who has squandered every opportunity to effectively respond to this crisis, and not only failing to get the tests. I think we've tested a little more than 1% of the US population, or the personal protective equipment, or getting the ventilators to the states that need it, or managing the food supply to this country. But in some ways, this guy is actively calling for insurrection in different communities and in different states. And people are responding. You have folks with weapons of war, AR-15s, AK-47s, dressed in tactical battle gear, storming the steps of the state legislatures, trying to, through the threat of violence, intimidate lawmakers into prematurely reopening their states, reopening businesses, or for other political ends. And in a reminder of the consequence of this kind of rhetoric, yesterday, Memo Garcia, who we all called Tank here in El Paso, lost his life. He had been on respirators and ventilators and feeding tubes for the last 9 months after he was shot in a Walmart here in El Paso, Texas, by a gunman who was inspired by President Trump. Trump, who warned of invasions and infestations of immigrants from Latin America. This guy drove 600 miles from Allen, Texas with an AK-47, came to El Paso, opened fire in a Walmart, killed 22 people, now 23 with Memo's death yesterday. The president's rhetoric, his politics, the policies he's implemented, not only make it harder for us to respond to this crisis, but further tear this country apart. Add to that our loss of global leadership, where we should be leading the world in managing this crisis, and we have withdrawn and retrenched, literally leaving the World Health Organization, or at least threatening to do so, in the midst of the greatest pandemic in the last 100 years. Lastly, why the fuck do I have any hope given all of that right now? I've been spending my days volunteering at the food bank here in El Paso, Texas, where we see lines that stretch 2 or 3 miles long of people queuing up to try to get a week's worth of groceries so that they can just survive. We've seen more unemployment filings in Texas, including in my hometown of El Paso, in the last 4 weeks than we saw in all of last year. And yet people are stepping up, they're volunteering, they're donating to the food bank. Folks are innovating. It's calling forth the best ingenuity in America. And you're also seeing people in positions of public trust at the governor level, at the county judge level, who, in the vacuum of leadership left by this president, are also stepping up and providing what we need as a country right now. And then lastly, you all may have seen this a couple of weeks ago, Wisconsin went ahead and held elections, despite the fact that every public health expert said this is really dangerous to ask people to go in person to cast a ballot. In fact, since then, we know of at least 40 confirmed cases of COVID-19 from people who went out to vote. And yet, though this was an extremely cynical attempt on the part of Republicans to depress or suppress voting in Wisconsin, people still came out and the Democrat won in that election. I think that bodes very well in states like mine in Texas, where the government is still asking people to vote in person. And there's a fight right now about whether that will be mail-in ballots or in-person ballots. But for us to change the set of circumstances that I just described, we're going to need new leadership from the president on down to the Senate, the US Congress, and in our state legislatures. And that's where I'm going to be focusing my attention going forward and through November of 2020. So that's kind of a quick summation of my thoughts at the moment. Very happy to take your questions.
Cool, yeah. So when you talk about how this pandemic has gotten really bad, worst pandemic 100 years, and the US is responding much worse than many other developed countries, do you think that's something kind of a personnel problem? So you think that's something the president, kind of, you had a different president you could fix, or it's something more structurally wrong with American democracy, like Warren or Sanders talked about during the campaign?
Yeah, I think both are true. I think this is in fact the great revealer of the disparities and the divisions that exist in American life. You look at a city like Chicago, African Americans represent 30% of the population, and yet they comprise 70% of the deaths. You see similar numbers in the state of Louisiana, and we don't have those statistics for every state because not every state, like my state, is keeping track of who is dying by race and ethnicity. But this reveals the systemic foundational problem of structural racism in America. African Americans have a much harder time getting access to healthcare, and even when they do, are treated differently than white Americans in the same system. But to your first question, or the first part of your question, this is all about leadership and failed leadership. You have states right now bidding against each other for personal protective equipment or for ventilators that are needed to literally keep people breathing and keep them alive. In that kind of confusion and chaos, it calls for a leader who can orchestrate the delivery and the logistics and the dissemination of needed equipment and medical supplies and tests. As you probably know, the president can call on the Defense Production Act, which allows him to compel any manufacturer in the United States to make the things that we lack and need to keep people alive. And then this willful sowing of confusion and chaos by asking different people in different states to liberate themselves from their state governments. And this is hard to believe, and I'm sure everyone is aware of this, but the president literally musing about injecting household disinfectants or somehow passing sunlight through your body to try to fight the coronavirus. Yeah, you're seeing a total failing in leadership that is totally commensurate with the high number of infections and deaths that we're seeing in this country.
Yeah, gotcha. So you talked a lot about how you want to kind of work on down ballot races at the state legislature level, the state Senate level, to try to get America in a better place. Do you see a vision for yourself in those things? Do you see yourself running for elected office again, or are you more happy to stay behind the scenes this time?
Yeah, I don't necessarily see myself getting involved. When I had to leave the presidential race in November, I remember the overwhelming thought in my head. And in fact, I asked this of my wife. I said, if I ever try to get involved in politics again, please kill me, take me out. What I want to do is get the hell away from all of this stuff. I've given 6 years of my life as a representative in Congress, 2 years on the trail in Texas, visiting every one of the 254 counties, and then a year running for president. I've done my part. And my wife, who is so much smarter than I am, reminded me that all the things that compelled us to run in the first place, the fact that we keep kids in cages on our southern border, the president's willful incitement of racism and white nationalist terror, all that stuff is still taking place. And in fact, is maybe worse than it was when we first got in. So I may not be a candidate, but I still got to be involved. And in a democracy, I don't believe there is the option to sit on the sidelines. And so my way of being involved is to support these state house candidates in Texas. We have a chance of winning the state legislature for the first time since 2001. And this is happening in a census year which will determine the redistricting of our state. And we are one of, if not the most racially gerrymandered and voter suppressed states in the union. It's why we've had one of the worst voter turnout records in the union. And if we win, not only can we draw more inclusive boundaries, but we can make progress on gun violence, expanding access to healthcare. Texas is the least insured state in the union. The largest provider of mental health care services in our state is the county jail system. The largest inpatient mental health care facility is the Harris County Jail. There are so many things that call for such urgent action, and it's only possible if we win those races. Great news is I won more votes than Ted Cruz did in 9 of the state house districts that we need to win this time. So not only can we do this, we have done it before. So I'm asking all of my volunteers and actually helping to organize and deploy them to these various state house districts in Texas to make phone calls and text right now when it's safe to do so, if it ever is, to knock on doors and engage with voters directly. So that's the kind of political engagement I'm most excited about and most likely to pursue going forward. I don't know if I'll ever run for office again.
Cool. Well, I think that's enough for questions from me. I have some questions that our members pre-submitted, so I'd like to ask you those as well. So Tara from Sydney Sussex College is asking, do you think kind of congressional Democrats are doing enough against the pandemic? How much blame do you put on them versus the Senate and the White House?
They're doing, I think, the best that they can, hampered by literally the inability to come together and do their job. May or may not know this, but there's no provision for voting at distance or by proxy in the House. There's no provision to hold committee hearings telephonically or via Zoom. And so Congress, unless they change the rules, their ability to do anything more effective than what they're doing right now is predicated literally on their ability to physically be together in this pandemic. And so it puts them at a distinct disadvantage relative to the president and his ability to hold these briefings every single day, as insane as they are. He commands the public attention, the bully pulpit, and therefore the policy and the direction that this takes. There is some discussion about a change in the rules for the House of Representatives to allow them to work at a distance, which I think will allow them to be much more effective. But some quick thoughts, they have authorized and appropriated now hundreds of billions of dollars to direct cash payments to Americans to help businesses through a program called PPP. But it has been rife with loopholes that allow massive corporate chains like Ruth's Chris Steakhouse or Auto Nation to get, in the latter's example, $95 million of taxpayer money that they do not need. It comes at the expense of small businesses that do need that help. So there are a lot of problems left unfixed so far. One that I'm super focused on is food security in the United States and the ability for people to be able to feed themselves and their families. Right now, it's happening at food banks through these extraordinary long lines. I would love Congress to expand what is known as SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or food stamps, and basically give Americans a card that they can take into a grocery store. And those supermarkets have mastered the logistics and every other aspect of food delivery. We have a system that works. Let's allow every American to enter into it. That's a failing of Congress so far that I would like them to rectify.
Yeah, and so do you think it's that congressional kind of Democrats in the House don't want to do it, or that they're not being bold enough in negotiating with Mitch McConnell to try to get those things across the line?
Yeah, I think it could be a combination of both of those. And I can understand, having been in Congress, that you cannot allow the enemy, the perfect to become the enemy of the good. And if you have the greatest public health crisis in our living memory, and you've got to focus on hospitals and clinics and trying to get these direct cash payments out, you prioritize those things. But if you leave out things like nutrition or voting by mail, which many of us believe Congress or Democrats should hold out for before they agree to any other additional relief package, then you will not have solved some of the other urgent problems that we have before us.
Okay, so taking a step back before the pandemic, the Democratic field this last cycle was the biggest in history, and lots of great people running it, including you. but came down the end to kind of a handful of people above the age of 70. Do you think that says anything about the party, that you had this party full of youth, but ended up becoming such a kind of an old group?
Yeah. It's really interesting. You had not only the largest, but the most diverse field of candidates in American history. And, it came down to, in the judgment of the Democratic Party's electorate, I believe the oldest nominee with the greatest level of government experience. Joe Biden, I think, served as a senator the first year he was age eligible to do so, and had been in the Senate for decades before serving as vice president, had run for president a couple of times before serving in the Obama administration. What do we take from that? I think that the electorate is looking for a trusted hand. They're looking for some continuity from the Obama administration. Rightfully, I hope, seeing the Trump administration as an historical aberration or anomaly. And I'll say this, at a moment where you have so much division and polarization in the country, to have someone who has such capacity for empathy and such a desire to heal, as I think Biden uniquely has, is really important. And then I'll also say this, I think though Bernie Sanders is far more progressive and far bolder in the proposals he made, and that could go for Elizabeth Warren as well. I think Biden also has the unique capacity to build coalitions and to actually make progress on some really progressive ideas. And he will, if he is the nominee, which it looks like he will be running on the most progressive platform in American history, in large part thanks to Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and others who pushed this party and this country to think a lot bigger than we had before. So I think that all plays into the selection of Biden.
Yeah, definitely. So you've campaigned with Joe Biden. You've kind of, the guy a bit. Who do you think, what kind of person do you think he's looking for in the vice presidency? And that's from Max from Pembroke.
Yeah, I think like all of us, he wants to win, and he wants to defeat Trump. He gets that Trump poses an existential threat to the republic, to American democracy, part of this larger global trend, right, of authoritarianism and strongmen and the flouting of constitutional norms and institutions that we've relied on for 230 plus years. And so he is, I would guess, and I haven't spoken to him about this, but he is looking to build a ticket that will allow him to be as competitive as possible. Gretchen Whitmer, who's the governor of Michigan, is probably really attractive in that sense. Elizabeth Warren, again, who has such great, bold policy credentials and has a plan for everything, I think is going to help with part of the electorate. Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, if you look at the Midwest and the upper Midwest, if you're thinking geographically. But there are other potential candidates who transcend geography, or maybe add to that. I think of Kamala Harris, who has a really devoted following well outside of California, and then Stacey Abrams in Georgia. But for voter suppression and the deletion of hundreds of thousands of voters from the rolls, she would be the governor of Georgia right now and would not be opening the state as the current Governor Kemp is doing. And she also has a national following, and I think would be a historic choice and be very energizing for a lot of people across the country. So he has an embarrassment of choices from which to make this decision.
Do you think there might be a problem with him picking Kamala Harris, given how aggressive Senator Harris was about Joe Biden's record on busing back in the 1970s? That was a really vicious attack that really...
Right. I think all that stuff, when you get to the general election, is water under the bridge. You think about, go back to 1980 and Ronald Reagan selecting George H.W. Bush. I mean, they had a pretty bitter primary battle. You think about JFK selecting Lyndon Johnson. Those two guys fucking hated each other. And And yet Kennedy understood that adding Johnson to the ticket in 1960 would allow him to compete effectively in Texas and through much of the South. And then you had, Johnson's ability to command a following in the Senate where he'd been the majority leader. So I think the raw calculation, the realpolitik, the necessity of winning and presenting the most viable ticket, that trumps, that takes precedence over personal feelings or past political fights.
And something that would be different this time around, given how old Joe Biden is that kind of there's a more likely chance that the vice president ended up being president than with kind of Obama, who's in his 40s or something. So do you think that's something that Joe Biden should consider, or?
Yeah, I mean, statistically, right? In terms of lifespan and any other consideration you want to take around someone's age, yeah, this is perhaps one of, if not the most important decisions for a major party nominee for the presidency. Because there's a really good chance, either through election or through, or a better than normal chance through some other course, that person selected as vice president will have to command the office of the presidency. So yeah, I think their vetting process will probably take that into account as well.
Yeah, so you took some pretty progressive positions, as you say, on guns, on kind of taking away churches' tax exemptions during your national run when you were running president. Do you think kind of those kind of policy choices were different from the ones you took when you're running in Texas? Do you think it's a different electorate that you're targeting, or how did you compare your views on the two races?
I think you are constantly developing the positions that you hold. The more people you meet, the more you listen to, the more you learn. That can't help but impact how you see things. And for me, I mentioned the shooting at the Walmart in El Paso in August of 2019, having now 23 people in my community killed by a white nationalist terrorist armed with a weapon that was designed, engineered, and sold to militaries for the express purpose of killing people as effectively and efficiently as possible. Don't need it for hunting, don't need it for self-defense. It is intended to kill people. The question for me was, why the fuck do we keep selling these things? And not only that, why do we allow people to possess them? There's no good civilian use for an AR-15 or an AK-47. And so, that really kind of shocked me out of perhaps some political complacency around this issue. I think I was already probably at the furthest edge on gun policy that you could be in Texas, and conventionally thought to be still viable. But when I looked at what Australia had done, when I looked at what other parts of the world had done successfully to reduce the use of these weapons of terror and weapons of war, you can make the political calculation, or you can just figure out what the right thing to do is, and then just hope that the politics follow. And in that case, that's what I did. And I don't know how much that hurt me or my prospects. I don't know how much it helped, but I've always found that I'm happiest as a human being and most successful in public life when I just figure out what the right thing to do is. I've never taken a poll. You've never hired a pollster. I've never, focus group tested an idea or a talking point. It's just never read a speech. I've never had somebody write a speech that I've read. I just, if I add anything to the debate or the conversation or public life, it is meeting people, listening to what's important to them, and then incorporating that into what I say about what I want to do for this country. And that, in the case of guns or our drug laws or our criminal justice system, or pick an issue, it's my personal convictions, and then making sure I have the courage of those convictions to say them out loud.
Yeah, so obviously kind of everyone's talking about this pandemic. It's a huge kind of biggest public policy problem in generations. Do you think there are other problems in the future that kind of American politics is overlooking right now? So do you think we're overlooking the risk of cyber attack or something else that could be coming around the next horizon?
Nothing as critical, as important, as urgent, as existential as climate. And more important, arguably, than our public health response to the pandemic. And they're not mutually exclusive, and we can take them both on at the same time. So don't want to imply that we should do one over the other. But, you know, we are concerned right now about a global death toll that might be measured in the single-digit millions, which is extraordinary and important. And every one of those lives is valuable. We should save everyone that we can. But if we fail to arrest the warming of this planet, and to do it very, very soon through extraordinarily difficult political choices that we all have to make, then we will lose human life in the hundreds of millions, in the billions over time. And that's indisputable if you look at the science, follow the facts, and are interested in the truth. And so, you know, we're just not wired to address existential threats that won't be borne out for decades or a generation at their worst. That's why we're pretty good, although, I mean, current president of the United States accepted, in meeting urgent existential threats. My life is in danger. I know how to respond right now. If my life or my kids or my grandkids' life is in danger down the road, I'm gonna have a much harder time summoning the political will to make really difficult decisions, transitioning off of fossil fuels or making multi-billion or trillions of dollars of investment in green energy infrastructure, electrifying the grid, forcing tough choices around jobs and where economic growth takes place. So that's the biggest thing that we are overlooking. And when I say we, I mean it's the world, but the United States, more than any other country, given our consumption of carbon-based fuels, our emissions, and the size of our economy, has kind of a singular role to play in leading the world right now, and we are failing at it.
Yeah, so the Sunrise Movement, which is like a activist group agitating for Green New Deal, kind of somewhat famously gave Joe Biden F on their kind of climate change issue scorecard. So do you think that Joe Biden is really all that much better than the status quo compared to, say, your policies or, say, one of the more progressive people in the race?
I think this comes down to a matter of character, and it may get back to your question about why did people pick Joe Biden in the first place. The thing is, we can't anticipate every development like COVID-19. We can't anticipate every political opportunity or moment, such as the one that will come when we have a chance to actually do something about climate. And I think Biden, should he be our nominee and should he be elected president, might very well have an FDR moment. FDR faced with, you know, the greatest depression, the greatest global depression in modern history at that point, faced with rising authoritarianism around the world and rising authoritarianism tendencies in the United States, helped to orchestrate the largest expansion of the social safety net, from Social Security to the Works Progress Administration, on and on and on, completely rethinking and recalibrating the size of government. I think Joe Biden's got that in him. He may not be the guy who proposes the idea. I don't know that Roosevelt was the person who proposed the big ideas, although he had some extraordinary opportunities in New York State as governor there. But he was the person who could sense the political opportunity and pushed as far as was possible the envelope on the social safety net in the United States of America. I think Joe Biden's got that same capacity, and I think his capacity to work with the Congress and the Senate, his capacity to build public will and then to use it effectively, are going to be needed if we're going to meet this moment. So I don't know that it's so much about the white papers that different presidential candidates put forth as it is their character and their ability to respond to an opportunity once it presents itself.
Great. Well, there's lots more to talk about, but I think our half hour is over now. So it's great talking to you, Beto. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you for having me. I'm grateful.
Thank you. And subscribe to our YouTube page, like us on Facebook. Thank you.
Bye-bye. We'll see you all.